Greetings, AP Euro scholars, for our review, Unit 7, Post-Napoleonic Europe, looking at a bunch of isms: conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, socialism, romanticism. Conservatism, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom, refers to the goals of the victors over Napoleon, which included legitimacy, putting the rightful rulers back on their thrones; secondly, maintaining a balance of power; and thirdly, preventing any future revolutions. And to stop this, the victors over Napoleon were generally speaking in opposition to liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. The architect of the post-Napoleonic conservative Europe is an Austrian named Clemens von Metternich, and the Congress of Vienna, which met in 1815, is a meeting of the four victors, and these are the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, and the English. And the Concert of Europe refers to a continuing meeting of the victors over Napoleon, only this time including France. And the military alliance between these parties is also called the Quadruple and then the Quintuple Alliance when you have France. Now what happens is the Bourbons are put back on the throne in France, an example of legitimacy. This time it's the brother of Louis XVI who is executed. He's guillotined, and it's the brother is Louis XVIII. You may ask what happened to Louis XVII. He is going to die in prison under the revolutionaries. The Carlsbad Decrees, these are laws censoring German university students, maintaining conservatism, sort of fighting, radical beliefs of idealistic students in German schools. And the Burschenschaft is one of these German groups, one of these German nationalist groups that's pushing liberal ideas and ideas of a unified Germany. Liberalism, in short, liberalism is the opposite of conservatism, and you need to sort of erase the current idea of liberalism. Don't think Democratic Party and Clinton and Obama and Bernie Sanders and all that. Liberalism refers to individual rights and limited government. And limited government here includes a constitution and expanded voting rights and economic free trade, as opposed to, say, mercantilism or high tariffs or government intervention. Nationalism is the belief that an ethnic group, a group with a particular language and a particular culture and a particular history, should be unified, and should be unified within a common border. And this group should be self-governing. So you have groups that are divided. Think of Germany and Italy up to this point, wanting to unite. Then you have groups that are under the thumb of a larger group. Think of Austria-Hungary, the Magyars or the Hungarians under control of the Austrian Germans, or the Poles under control of various neighboring nations after the Polish partitions. The revolutions of 1830, in this calendar year, you see a rising up of liberalism and nationalism. Belgium is going to split off successfully from the Netherlands. Remember, southern Belgium is predominantly Catholic, is the big difference. Poland is going to have a failed rebellion against the Russians, and you have rebellions in Italy, which are all going to be snuffed out. In France, you have a rebellion against, after Louis XVIII dies, the throne is going to pass to his brother Charles X, who is a reactionary, an extreme conservative. He's going to abolish the Constitution, shut down the legislature. He's going to impose censorship. And there's going to be a rebellion against him in the streets. He's going to flee to England. And Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, is going to be a branch of the Bourbon gang, is going to be crowned King of the French and put into power. Now, King of the French, notice he's not King of France, he's King of the French, which is going to be the substitution of popular sovereignty for hereditary monarchy. So in 1848, you have another series of revolutions. There's an economic depression in Europe, there's some bad harvests, and most famously the Irish potato famine. But there's also hunger and bad crop yields in northern Europe. And there's continued demands of liberals and nationalists. And where are the revolutions? Well, there's revolutions in the Italian states, there's revolution in the German states, in Denmark, and in Austria-Hungary. Now, before this, you have, actually before the Revolution of 1830, you have the Decembrists. These are liberal Russian officers who rise up against the new Tsar in St. Petersburg, and they're crushed in 1825. But you have a failure of the revolutions. After initial apparent success, you have a Russian army invading Austria-Hungary to crush the Hungarians who have declared their independence under Louis Kossuth. You have the Austrian army, which is, rebels are going to chase the Habsburg monarch out of Vienna, and an Austrian army is going to reassert control by the end of the year. Louis Philippe is going to flee. Remember, he's in power. He's put into power in 1830, but his government is not very liberal at all, even though he calls himself the bourgeois monarch. And he's going to flee, and Louis Napoleon III is going to be elected. This is the nephew of the Napoleon. And he's going to launch a coup against his own government in 1851. He's going to sort of pull a Napoleon by declaring himself emperor, Napoleon III. So conservatism will reign triumphant after this this little episode, or big episode across Europe, of attempts to exert liberalism and nationalism. Maybe most famously, in 1848, the Frankfurt Parliament is going to attempt to unite Germany, and they offer the crown to the King of Prussia, who will spurn it. He says it's a crown from the gutter with the stench of revolution. He's not going to be beholden to these liberal middle-class lawyers in this legislature. And one of the debates that's interesting in the Frankfurt Parliament is, will Germany include or will it not include Austria? And the idea of including Austria, this is the Grossdeutsch, the big Germany position, and that one is going to be rejected. And basically, Austria does not want to join an entity which will certainly be dominated by the Prussians. And the one that includes Prussia but not Austria is called the Kleinstdeutsch option. Anyhow, this offer is sort of dead in the water when Frederick William IV of Prussia says he will not accept this crown from his inferiors. So German unification will have to wait till later, and that will be our next unit class. Thomas Malthus is a British economist who's going to say in his essay on the principle of population that population growth will always surpass the growth of the food supply. This is also called the Malthusian trap, and economics is, at this time in Great Britain, is going to be nicknamed the dismal science because it's very pessimistic, that the government really can't do anything, that the poor are basically locked into poverty, and it's just their lot to suffer. There will not be enough food. David Ricardo sort of reiterates this with his iron law of wages. David Ricardo, another Brit, says that if you increase wages, people will just eat more and have more babies, and these babies will become workers, and the wages will drop if there's more workers, and they'll get paid less, and there'll be more deaths, and there's this cycle that whatever you do, the poor will remain poor, and there's kind of this, and it's a kind of this little bit of this laissez-faire idea that growth in population will always drive down wages, and there'll never be enough food. Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx is a socialist who says he is historical. He says he is scientific, and he mockingly calls these other socialists before him utopian socialists. He says they're silly. He says they're talking about a utopia, a no-place government, which will never happen. And so what is Karl Marx's great insight? He says that it's class struggle that drives history. And he says in the past it was, for 1,000 years or whatever, you've got feudalism, lords and serfs, until you have the growth of cities, the growth of a middle class. And this middle class is going to displace the lords and the serfs. And now you have a new tension. And getting all philosophical here, Marx is borrowing from Hegel, who's a German philosopher who talks about thesis and antithesis, this clash which brings forth a synthesis, a new order. And this new order that's waiting to be born is this communist society, but not until the bourgeoisie who own these factories are overthrown by the industrial proletariat. The proletariat are the industrial working class. So Marx is positing here this inevitable historical change which drives history is leading to revolution. The exploitation is becoming insufferable, and Marx and many others are looking at the misery in the cities of Europe, and they're saying it shouldn't go on. And Marx says what will happen here is there will be a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, and eventually you will have this communist order where the government will wither away and the workers will share what they have to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. And keep in mind here, the proletariat are the factory workers. According to Karl Marx, the revolution has to take place in an industrial society. It cannot take place in an agricultural society, because that's not scientific, that's not historical, which is what sets him apart from these utopians. And some utopians to know, you've got Saint-Simon, who is advocating sort of a technocratic society directed by essentially engineers. And then you've got Charles Fourier and his phalanxes, this idea of a society of, over a sort of a 1,000 range, and people have different jobs that correspond to their aptitudes, and they switch their jobs, and it's kind of a commune where people are happily working together, and these things, in the short, don't happen. In England, you have the Reform Bill of 1832, sometimes called the Great Reform Bill, and the big deal with this is, in England, whereas you've got all these revolutions breaking out over the continent in 1820, 1825, 1830, 1848. In England, you do have rebellion of the Chartists, and you have the Peterloo Massacre and all that. But this is sort of small change compared to what's going on in Europe, because you have reform from within. And what the Reform Bill is going to do is it's going to increase the number of voters. And this bill that passes in 1832 is going to increase the number of those who are able to vote to 1 out of 5, and this is a large number than before. But most importantly, it's going to give for the first time seats in the Parliament to these new cities, such as Manchester, which I think at this time is somewhere in the ballpark of 100,000 people. Whereas you've got these boroughs, think of a county, a constituency, with some of these boroughs had somewhere in the ballpark of a dozen or so people living in them. They're sort of dead. They're towns that have sort of shriveled and blown away, but they still have members in Parliament. So this injustice is being rectified. Some other solutions to urban poverty and low wages besides Marxism: you do have Chartism. You have this demand, and you have these huge petitions that are signed, ignored by Parliament, but asking for universal manhood suffrage. You have syndicalism. This is trade unions, and this is really big in France in particular, that are promoting strikes as a political weapon. You have the utopian socialists, you have the Reform Act of 1832, and you have calls for free trade, especially as England becomes the economic powerhouse of Europe and wants to sell their stuff outside of their own country. London's Crystal Pavilion in 1854. This is this huge exhibition hall made out of these huge glass windows. Kind of think of sort of like a jumbo greenhouse in a sense, and it showcases British technology and industrial success. Romanticism and characteristics of romantic art. Think of Romanticism as being the counterpart, the opposite of the Enlightenment. The Romantics focused on emotion and intuition and feelings. They glorified the past and tradition instead of progress. They focused on the individual. They focused on nature. And Romanticism is largely a reaction to the excesses of the Enlightenment, the impersonal faith of deism, the attack on faith by the French revolutionaries. Romanticism is in opposition to the violence of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Think of the painting of the slaughter of Spanish civilians that Goya paints. Think of the growth of filthy, industrial, crowded, putrid cities And we're going to see in Romantic art a lot of paintings of, and if you see paintings of rivers and waterfalls and wind through the trees and ponds and rainbows and mountains, you probably have Romantic art, because the contrast here is, nature is good and the ugliness of the cities is bad. So just some thoughts here on post-Napoleonic Europe. This conservative order, is going to last pretty well for close to a century, until we get to World War I. You have some some stones are thrown in the pond here with these rebellions in 1830 and 48, but their conservatism keeps the peace. We're going to be approaching the Franco-Prussian War, which is really the biggest war in Europe after the end of Napoleon. But even that war is going to last a short 6 months. So this is basically conservative Europe trying to keep the lid on those who want more political participation, liberals, those who want their own country, nationalists, those who want more economic justice and equality, or socialists, and then you've got your romantics who are sort of thinking nature thoughts on the side. So there you go, signing out.